Attention student. I said to stay away from that thing. It cannot be opened. Recess is over. Please report to class for your punishment.
Retro shooters, or retro-inspired shooters, seem to resonate with a lot of people in the indie community. They provide a window into the past but return with modernized control schemes and familiar graphics. There is this fuzzy but warm feeling that only comes to fruition for me when games came out with late 90s style graphics. Stuff that you would see in Quake or Half-Life or anything else on the PS1. Zortch is a game that feels like an alternate reflection of that time. A game that spawned from another dimension in the 90s that we never saw. It's a game that wears its low poly skin like it was always there. And what we have is someone that decided that it was a good idea to blend the alien but run-down industrial setting of OddWorld and combine it with Quake or Unreal Gold's gameplay, or Turok, and had the gall to release it into the indie shooter stratosphere. And well, it actually worked out. So Mutant Leg, well done. Now go make Zortch 2. Anyway, so this game, it's kind of like a brain fuck, to be honest, and not like in a plot twist sense that you didn't see coming, but from the moment that you even look at it. Even the character herself is perplexed how such a holiday could comprise of enemies that could jump around like a trampoline in an alien world that has fast food burger joints, fonts that you would see in the early days of the internet, and I mean early. Zortch is what I would call zany. Something that goes off the beaten path, scrambles the settings that we know and puts it into a blender. Your character Zortch Maximum was expecting a holiday after getting bored from her daily life. It all seemed so promising at first. Everything that she hoped for, at least, well, until she got caught. Now in Quake fashion, you have to find weapons, secrets, keys, and then the exit door. I am so fucking sick of fighting keys in this game, but because of how fun it is, I'm able to ignore this fact. The game itself is also trippy with its setting and enemies, but decides to ground it in reality when it comes to doors. And some levels you'll have the time of your life wandering around looking for a button to activate or a generator that shuts down the shields that block you from moving past them. The enemies themselves are a mixed bunch of weirdos, all formidable and want to kill you and suck your brains, for it's their main source of nourishment to relieve the pain that they experience on a daily basis, even though that they have an endless supply of cans and other types of food lying around the joint. But everyone has their own preferences, I guess. Speaking of keys, so many retro shooters seem to be stuck with them. It would be nice to kick a door down for once, like in Postal 2 or in Cruelty Squad. But what they do have at least in common are the low poly aesthetics. I've gotten used to them at this point. Some have genuinely impressed me, because even in spite of the limits to the polygons, they still collectively make for interesting designs and environments in their respective games. Some games just make something that's passable and not very impressive. But Zortch absolutely nails its own style, and is one of the few games that understands those limitations from back then, or what a game from the late 90s would actually look like. You look at Quake 2, or Turok, or Unreal Gold. They're very rough on the surface, but were technical marvels at the time. Zortch goes for something in between. It is very rough on the surface, like I said, but it's supposed to be. Textures don't have the same level of definition you would see in high poly games, as in the AAA stuff, but nailing that Quake 2 or Unreal Gold style is something that can sometimes be difficult to replicate properly, especially when you're more lenient towards adding a little more detail. It's a unique challenge in itself, making something that stands out when you're operating on a low budget approach to making a game, as if you're running on low spec hardware. Some games like this can look like a glorified prototype, but Zortch does it with its zany and alien industrial setting, with some nice atmosphere and even some wildlife sections like you would see in Unreal Gold and Turok. I feel like this is the kind of game that would have been revolutionary in a alternate 90s timeline. The movement itself is very satisfying, from slide boosting to kick jumping. Some of the other boomer shooter characters should take notes from a movement demon like Zortch Maximum. Hell, she could even make for a good Warzone character for all the movement freedom that you have in this game. Some enemies even have the notion to jump around too, changing positions to stay with you all the way through. but because of the game's gracious loads of ammunition it throws in your face, you'll rarely be left running dry for anything in any of the combat scenarios. Even your wrench has some uses, throwing it as a boomerang or insta-killing the ventilation shaft so you can squeeze in. The other weapons are also really fun to use too. Even the pistol gets its flowers, giving you some decent firepower and even a shield to boot. A lot of the other weapons have secondary functions that can be a lifesaver in some cases. Now, funny enough, when I had the grenade launcher, it took me quite a few levels until I right-clicked on it, realizing that it could also shoot rockets. It was there the whole time. Not a bright bulb moment for me, but I'll live. Every other weapon, including those two, feel effective and are fun to use. And the shotgun, even with its snail-paced rate of fire, can make a Jill sandwich out of any alien when given the opportunity. Now, as for some of the other weapons, you have your grenades, proximity mines, a machine gun, a flamethrower, a beam weapon that's pretty good against certain enemies. Here's a secret: if at any point you have to face those fuckers that multiply every time you kill one, use the flamethrower and solve that problem permanently. Once you're comfortable with your arsenal, you'll see just how formidable your character is. Even though she got gaslit by aliens promising an awesome holiday, she kicks a lot of ass on her own, and even has some graffiti in her name by someone that I assume that sees her as a revolutionary, resisting against the alien overlords. As for the story itself, you're not missing out on much. The game shares the same symptom as a lot of shooters from the 90s, where the story was not really being fleshed out, but rather was just there to provide context as to what, where, and why your character was there in the first place. You go in, you give the aliens here the mobile infantry treatment for about 5 episodes. You will be seeing different parts of the world and the facilities, some new enemies and eventually more of the same enemies, all the while making your way up the food chain so you can get the hell out of Dodge. And it's just a lot of fun. Resources are plentiful, but you're still bound to get some damage from time to time. A vacation for you, technically speaking. Combat is otherwise standard, supported by the game's fun and floaty sense of movement where you can dance around the arena like you've always been doing it the whole time, defying physics like kick jumps and sliding across long distances. It makes some games boring when I get this level of movement, and in this game's case, that's a good thing because movement for me is just as crucial as gunplay. This game does a great job with both, thankfully. And once you've figured out how to break the game's movement and play at a much faster pace, it changes the experience of the game dramatically compared to the first time when you played it. The game feels old, like in a time capsule, whereas lots of other retro games feel new, even with the old aesthetics. But the most important aspect to replicate is the feeling of it just being a game, without needing to be anything more. Zortch looks to be a game that was a product of its time, even down to some of the sound effects of the weapons, enemies, and even the music that you don't really notice too much. The setting is one of the game's most unique aspects and makes it stand out from a lot of other boomer shooters. You usually either have sci-fi or fantasy, and this game goes the sci-fi route but brings along the burgers and the milkshakes and the cans, text that you can't read but looks like it's from the 90s, zany and nostalgic are words that come to mind here. It feels like the kind of game that you'd read about in a game magazine back in the day, out with your friends, and you see this game with its weird logos and enemies that came out of your own imagination, snails that shoot rockets or giant eyeballs that shoot at you, infinite plant-like creatures that multiply, and yes, even Thing makes an appearance here. The developer put a lot of effort into recreating enemies and made sure the textures had enough detail to make the enemies and everything else stand out, but not too much to the point where it would push the game's graphical fidelity to the 2000s. For me, this game creates a sweet spot between 1997 and 98 in terms of graphical fidelity, and making an engine revolved around that time period, and in effect making this game accessible for a lot of low-end rigs. Making a fully fledged game is impressive, but also making your own engine is something else entirely. So much can go wrong in creating your own game engine within your source code. It can run fine on one system and on another, be showered with bugs, creating a cycle of updates that you have to constantly do in order to fix it and make it more optimized for multiple systems. But Zortch feels very well optimized, runs like a dream, which is more important than anything else, because if it runs like shit, then you cannot appreciate anything else the game offers. The developer himself has a backlog of games on his itch.io page, a bundle of platformers and some shooters, stuff that you would see on the DOS, but the most notable one that links to Zortch is Necrobox. This game was made during the 2020 Bad Lovecraft Games Jam, set in the 20s where you fall victim to Cthulhu's long-distance prank calls, while you go about shooting different types of blobs. You could say that this game was like a building block for what would eventually be Zortch. In fact, it even has the same menu fonts. It's very rough and very short, but if you want to see the foundations of this game, then it starts here. Zortch is a game with a lot to offer, plenty of great weapons to play around with, a ton of enemies, and a world that seemed like it was being imagined a long time ago. Great level design and a weird and trippy sense of atmosphere in a 90s centric package. Some shooters like Slayers X and Carnal nail this unique feeling as well, where it's more than just a game copying 90s graphics, but a game that feels like a product of the 90s. Zortch is unapologetically wacky and still remains a fun time, packed with 15 levels that are large and have plenty to explore, including bonus levels that showed earlier concepts of the game, and even a level like Dead Simple from Doom 2. Low budget doesn't always mean bad, and this game is an example of that. The low budget method is a great opportunity for developers to really drive in their creative juices even in spite of the limitations. Some of the best games as of late have made deliberate compromises in the pursuit of creating something that is more retro than what appears on the surface, and it's paid off immensely for them. Just look at Cruelty Squad, for instance. And if you want a game that really nails down the late 90s period of shooters like Quake 2, Unreal Gold, or Turok, then Zortch is the game to check out. It's like a cousin from an alternate dimension, you know, a face that you've seen before but not here, or like a can of Coke that says Cola Coke instead of Coca-Cola. Speaking of familiarity, I also could have sworn that some of the enemies were firing plasmas that sounded like the ones from Halo. Must have just been me. Anyway, grab a burger, cases of canned drinks, a snack bar that gives you health, maybe even go on a fun trip while playing this game. The developer probably did the same thing while making it. Also, the game's install size is very small. Cannot say the same though for a lot of Unity-based retro shooters. Stay tuned, and thank you for watching.